Confucian Origins, the teachings of Master Kong. Some questions from last time. Why is it so difficult to define religion? Is the category religion sui generis? Where did the notion of religion even come from? Part 1. The School of the Refined. There's a lot to say about what we call things. Names make a difference. Names tell us what we think is most important, what comes first, or what is definitive about something. We now know that the very notion of religion is a creation of the modern West. Following the rupture called the Protestant Reformation, Protestants and Catholics started to use the category religion in a way much like us today, except they thought that religion only applied to Christianity. But as those Westerners started to travel the world and to explore, colonize, and build their empires, they brought the category of religion with them. And in time, they began to name the various human activities and beliefs they encountered as new examples of religion. When Western Europeans would arrive in a new land, they would label certain phenomena as religion, using the European suffix ism. When Catholic Jesuit missionaries arrived in China in the early 17th century, they started to catalog a series of cultural beliefs and practices which these Europeans called Confucianism. These missionaries from the West thought that this was a certain tradition, a certain religion, that was bound together by a human figure called Confucius, a teacher who had lived in the 5th century before the Christian era. Think about that word Confucianism for a minute. Confucianism. If you had nothing else to go on, you would suppose that followers of Confucianism were to a historical figure called Confucius, as the followers of Christianity were to the historical figure called Christ. Presumably, followers of Confucianism think of this man Confucius as their religion's founder and attributed to him supernatural or even divine importance, like Christians do to Jesus. A confusion like that would be understandable, though, because the people who coined the term Confucianism weren't Confucianists, they were Christians. Now, people everywhere have the habit of assuming that everyone thinks just like they do. These particular Christians who came to China incorrectly thought that the Chinese thought of Confucius the way they themselves thought of Jesus. But they were wrong. So here's our first problem. Can we get beyond the name Confucianism? Remember, that name, Confucianism, like the category of religion, is an outside projection. It's not what these people called themselves. No one in ancient China would have thought about herself as a Confucianist. No one identified herself as a follower of Confucius. There was no one named Confucius. Even that name is a Latinization, a thought being passed to us through the filter of early modern Christianity. Now, we're going to keep using the name Confucianism because that's the standard name for it in English. But always remember that that name is a later, foreign invention, and it might cause you to misinterpret the data that we're looking at. That something called Confucianism self-identifies as Rujia, the school of the refined ones. The term Ru, to be refined, can also carry a sense of being educated, softened, or tamed. In other words, Ru means to be a wise person, a sage, someone who has tamed themselves and educated themselves. So the people called Confucianists by early modern Christian Europeans called themselves the Rujia, the school of the refined ones or the school of the sages. and those names have rather different points of reference. Confucianism suggests following a singular leader named Confucius who is unique in some way. But the School of the Refined suggests a number of different scholarly sources that work in harmony to refine the adept, to teach the student to become a scholar themselves. Part 2. The Life of Confucius. I mentioned a moment ago that even the name Confucius is a Western invention. That's true. It's a Latinization of the name Kongsu. Kong is his proper name, and Su is a title meaning master. So Kongsu, Confucius, means Master Kong. Now, he isn't the founder of a religion, the way the word Confucianism might trick us into thinking. His role in Confucianism is not comparable to Jesus' in Christianity, but he is still very important. He is a principal figure at the historical dawn of a long school of sages, and so it's useful to know something about him. Next thing. Confucius is said to have lived between the years 551 and 479 BCE, before the Christian era. So that's about 2,500 years ago, a mighty long time. And on top of that, most of the historical records of Confucius and his world come to us from a later time. His first biography wasn't written for centuries until after he had lived. And so, like all histories, we have to ask ourselves how much of Confucius's life and teachings are historical, and how much are later inventions of folklore, propaganda, and misremembrance. That is, we have to ask, who is the historical Confucius, the man who lived, worked, ate, and slept, as opposed to the Confucius who appears in historical literatures written by people who never even met him? That's an important distinction, and although we're going to encounter this problem throughout this course, we aren't going to get too bogged down by it. It's not that it's not an important question. We should always question the reliability of our information. But here, in this class, we're looking for what people think, believe, and practice, their religion. If people believe Confucius was born in the year 551 BCE, we should know that they believe that, even if he was not indeed born in 551 BCE. Now, around this time, when Confucius is said to have been born, Chinese civilization had already been around for centuries. The Zhou dynasty already had a complex system of feudal lords and ministers, artisans and poets, farmers and smiths. At the height of the economic and social structure was the noble family, the aristocrats. They wielded power and vied with each other for social and financial dominance. Also holding power, of somewhat of a different kind, were the dead ancestors of living people, and most especially the ancestors of those noble families. Like their living descendants, the noble ancestors received tribute in the form of rituals and offerings. When they were appeased, the ancestors blessed their progeny. And just as failing to give tribute to the living nobles could lead you to trouble, failing to give tribute to the dead nobles could prompt them to plague you in the form of an angry ghost. There were other supernatural forces at work as well. Chief amongst these was the quintessential ancestor figure, Tian, heaven, the celestial reality. Tian was not always imagined in the same way. Sometimes, Tian was like a sky god who thinks, acts, is pleased, or is angered. Other times, Tian is more like the Western conception of nature, a force, or a general principle of the world. Someone who is especially in accord with Tian, someone who has Tian's favor, is called the rightful ruler. This is usually translated into English as the mandate of heaven. Meanwhile, if a ruler does not act in accord with the will of Tian, he will be overthrown by someone more worthy than he is. Now, thinking about political power as the will of Tian, or as the mandate of heaven, we would say, can be very useful if you want to justify yourself and your noble family as the rightful rulers. See, even heaven's on our side. But problems arise because other families can make similar claims. Your enemies can say they have Tian's favor too, meaning many people can claim heaven wants them in power, and this can, and did, lead to fighting. In 771 BCE, the Zhou ruler was killed, and his power was divided between various warring factions. Lower-ranking noble families, not knowing which side to align with, or seeing a moment to seize power for themselves, started founding their own feudal principalities, states that would fight each other, break off from each other, and recombine into ever-new political reconfigurations. By the time Confucius was alive, there was more than 40 different Chinese nations. Each one had a ruling family, spending huge amounts of money on their unending wars and aristocratic luxuries. In an era with so many competing rulers, wealth flowed upward into an ever-expanding aristocratic class, their courts, and their armies, prompting the ascent of the most wealthy, the most conniving, and the most violent. This era, called the Spring and Autumn period, was the world in which Confucius lived. And like all people at all times, Confucius was a product of his environment. In a time when the social and political order had broken down, Confucius and his followers tried to find a method to restore it. The world had lost its way, its Tao. The Tao, literally a path or a road, is the way things ought to be. The right order of the self, the right order of the family, the right order of society, and the right order of the cosmos. And as someone who once met Confucius said, it was Confucius's place to restore the way, the Tao, for people to thrive again. The world has been without the way for a long time now, and heaven intends to use Confucius like a wooden clapper for a bell. Confucius was born near the modern city of Chufo in eastern central China. In his time, this was the state of Lu, and Confucius's father, once a noteworthy knight, was now a minor bureaucrat there. But when Confucius was only 3 years old, his father died, and he was raised by his mother alone. Then she too died when Confucius was not yet a full adult. He married and had a son and a daughter, and by the age of 20, Confucius was, just like his father, a minor member of the Lu bureaucracy. The young Confucius soon got something of a name for himself as one who understands Li. Li means custom or decorum. It includes understanding ancient rites needed for marriages and funerals, those offerings, dances, songs, words, and prayers needed to please the ancestors and Tian most of all. But it also included personal behavior and manners, to have good form in one's actions, to dress properly, to be learned in history and art and poetry, to study music. Confucius was an avid singer and played the zither. To act well in demeanor, in mood, and in disposition, as well as in rituals. Later, when visiting a famous temple, a student of Confucius even mentions that his master asked so many questions about the custom and rituals of the place that the people there got annoyed. When the master went to the great ancestral temple, he asked questions about everything that took place. Someone said, "Who said that this supposed expert understands ritual?" When he went to the great ancestral temple, he had to ask questions about everything. When this comment was reported to the master, his reply was, "This asking is, in fact, part of ritual." Not only was Confucius personally and professionally interested in Li, ritual and decorum, asking lots of questions about Li was itself a part of Li. Confucius rose through the ranks of the Lu administration as a specialist in the Li needed for statecraft. But that was not to last for him. A new ruler came to power in Lu, someone Confucius found immoral and did not wish to serve. And so Confucius left, and for the next 14 years he traveled the principalities and dukedoms of the spring and autumn period, looking for a new patron, someone to follow his advice and lead his people using Li, the proper morals, customs, and rituals. He never found this patron. Although Confucius did find some audience with various rulers of his day, none of them took him seriously for long. But why? What was Confucius asking of them? Remember that Confucius, like many people in his day, believed that a ruler could only succeed with the favor of Tian, heaven, and the ancestors. The proper ruler must appease them through right ritual observance. But it wasn't just about rituals. The proper ruler must also cultivate personal virtue to earn the mandate of heaven and the trust of his people. He must be a wise, level-headed, pious sage, not a warlord. But in an age of warlords, this was not welcome counsel. It probably sounded ridiculous to the rulers of the day, actually. The world was in a constant state of war. Violence was everywhere. Corruption and intrigue was everywhere. And this homeless teacher arrives and says that the best way to political stability is reading books and being humble? Not only was Confucius' advice criticism, it probably didn't even sound like useful criticism. It's no wonder that no ruler was willing to pay him for it. But others were. In time, Confucius had a large following behind him. Later sources say that Confucius had thousands of followers with an inner circle of 72 pupils. Common people were moved by this wandering sage. In a time of madness, Confucius was teaching moderation and sanity, how to bring peace through pleasing Tian, the ancestors, and one's neighbor. In short, how to have ren, benevolence, humaneness, goodness. These words, attributed to Confucius, say, "Desiring to take his stand, the one who is good helps others take their stand. Wanting to realize himself, he helps others realize themselves. Being able to take what is near at hand as an analogy could perhaps be called the method of goodness." The teaching here is about reciprocity, seeing the analogy of yourself in others. If you want to take a stand, you have to help other people take a stand. If you want to be your best self, you have to help others be their best selves. That, Confucius is saying here, is how a person is supposed to act. Ren is seeing yourself in the analogy of another person, a relative, a neighbor, a servant, a rival. While the powerful and ambitious might not be interested in this kind of virtue, commoners might have understood these teachings as a welcome balm. Giving up on finding a ruler who would listen to him, Confucius retired from his wandering and went home to Lu after 14 years. There, he continued teaching his students, and he spent his personal time editing the great classics of Chinese literature. There, in the land in which he was born, he died quietly in the year 479 BCE, around the age of 72. Although he would become the principal sage of the Rujia, the school of the refined one, the school of sages, Confucius never appears to have claimed to be such a sage himself. He doesn't even appear to be consciously forming a school at all. His advice tends to be rather humble and his teachings rather mild. He didn't appear to hold anything we might call an ideology. The master said, "Eating plain food and drinking water, having only your bent arm as a pillow, certainly there is a joy to be found in this." However, he did think of himself as a lifelong lover of learning and refining oneself. He spoke of Ren, ideal humaneness and compassion, but he never claimed it for himself. Later, one of his students, or a descendant of theirs, tells us Confucius recounted his own life thus, as a slow, gentle pursuit of ever more understanding. The master said, "At 15, I set my mind upon learning. At 30, I took my place in society. At 40, I became free of doubts. At 50, I understood heaven's mandate. At 60, my ear was attuned. And at 70, I could follow my heart's desires without overstepping the bounds of propriety." Part 3. The Analects. The teachings attributed to Confucius can be found in several sources, but the most essential of these are the Luenyu, the arranged sayings, or as they're universally called in English, the Analects. Like with the details of Confucius's life, we can quite rightly question the authenticity and editing process of the Analects. Did they really spring from Confucius's own mouth, or are they the creation of his later followers' imaginations? Again, it's a very important question, but we won't get into it here. Even though scholars have asked this question about the Analects for literally centuries, most Confucians, for most of history, don't care about this sort of thing. The Analects is a rather slim volume. In its present form, it's composed of 20 books or chapters, none of which would exceed a dozen pages in English translation. And, in turn, those chapters are composed only of little anecdotes. Someone says something, and then someone else, usually Confucius, called the Master, responds. None of the anecdotes in the Analects would translate into English as even a full page, and most are less than a full paragraph. And there's something very appropriate about that. One of the major themes of the Confucian Analects is to be subtle, mild, and not ostentatious. To do a lot without appearing to do much at all. This is referred to as non-doing, wu-wei, acting without acting. It means to work in full harmony with everything around you, without force, for things to work well, because things are well. For example, a certain child eats her vegetables at every meal, not because her mother yells or even asks her to eat them. The child eats her vegetables just because her mother is worthy of love and obedience. The mother, then, has acted without acting. The mother has demonstrated the ideal of wu-wei, because she is totally in harmony with her child, and thus good things will happen without any apparent effort. The Analects explain this in one scene in which a student complains that Confucius does not speak more teachings to him. Confucius then snaps back, "What does heaven ever say? Yet the 4 seasons go around and find their impetus there, and the myriad creatures are born from it. What does heaven ever say?" Heaven, Tian, never says anything, never acts, and yet everything happens as it's supposed to happen in the natural order of things. Heaven demonstrates perfect wu-wei, and a good ruler or teacher should be able to do the same. Confucius also tells of the mythical king of old, Shun, who once ruled by wu-wei alone. Shun merely performed his ritualistic position facing to the south, and all was well ruled. Shun didn't have to say or command anything. All he had to do was stand in a certain direction, south, and everything else would act as it's supposed to. All the pieces would fall into place. That is, Shun could govern his kingdom by Li alone. This is why Confucius thought it was so important. In the spring and autumn period, everything was violent and chaotic. Confucius and his disciples said this was because people had lost their proper Li, the right rituals, songs, dances, etiquette, and education. These are the instruments needed to produce Ren, humaneness in people, the ability to treat others with compassion and justice. The right way, the Tao, had been lost because Ren was lost, and when Ren was lost, it was because Li was lost. it was Li, the rituals and customs, that restore Ren. And when Ren humaneness was restored, the Tao would be found again. One cannot know or even guess about how heaven is going to act, and one can certainly not make heaven act in any way. And so it's pointless to try and change the world directly. But you can know about and change yourself. You can cultivate virtues, practice rituals, treat others with compassion, live with intention and gentle care, and that would harness the self. The only possible way to change the world and society would be to change and tame yourself. Some thoughts. What's the difference between Confucianism and Rujia? Are they the same thing? Does the name make a difference? Can you define the terms Tian, Tao, Li, Ren, and Wu Wei? What's the problem with the spring and autumn period, and how did the Confucian Analects claim that we could solve them? This lecture was based on the following works. First is Edward Slingerland's translation of Confucius's Analects, which, by the way, comes with a great introduction to them. It also includes great commentaries by famous commentators. Next is Xinghyang Yao's An Introduction to Confucianism, year 2000, and Li Dian Rainey's Confucius and Confucianism, 2010.